Hello, good evening. Welcome all of you this evening. So yes, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the double bill of inaugural lectures from the politics department here at SOAS tonight. As you know, inaugural lectures are this special occasion where we celebrate the scholarship of our esteemed colleagues. And tonight we have a particularly exciting program. Indeed, Professor Awino Okech and Professor Dan Plej have built out their intellectual footprint by constantly foregrounding their responsibilities as scholar activists. In their academic practice, they both display an unwavering commitment to reaching beyond the academic or scholarly world to render their work relevant and useful in the pursuit of social justice and human security. Whether it's through a focus on racial justice, envisioned from a feminist lens in Awino's work, or the pursuit of disarmament with an ambition of restoring a comprehensive approach to complete and general disarmament in Dan's, both colleagues demonstrate untiring desire and effort to act on levers that can bring about change in the world beyond the scholarly realm. In tonight's running order, we will first hear Awino's inaugural lecture as Professor of Feminist and Security Studies, and the title of her lecture is Feminist Worldmaking on Knowledge Infrastructures and Social Transformation. And this will be followed by Dan's inaugural lecture as Professor of Diplomacy and Strategy, with the title Weapons, Controls and Human Rights, Thinking Globally, Acting Globally. Each lecture will last for just under 30 minutes. There will be no opportunities for Q&A, but there should be ample opportunities for discussion during the post-lecture drinks reception, which will take place in the cloisters part of the Paul Webley Wing in Senate House. Now, as you probably also know, that each inaugural lecture will be formally introduced by a testimonial speaker. So moving on to the first part of this evening, I have the pleasure of introducing the first testimonial speaker, Professor Gina Heathcote. Professor Heathcote from Newcastle University is an expert on public international law and feminist methodologies. Her current research analyzes the international law of the sea and maritime security from a feminist perspective, with a particular interest in queer and post-human feminist understandings of ocean governance and non-Western legal understandings of ocean care or custodianship. She's currently a Leverhulme International Fellow for a project titled Saltwater Law, which examines decolonial legal methodologies and the potential for two-way research methods to shape international law and ocean governance. Prior to joining Newcastle Law School, Professor Heathcote was a professor of gender studies and international law here at SOAS in the School of Law. We are delighted to have you back here with us tonight, Gina.
Distinguished guests, fellow travellers, friends, ladies and gentlepeople, what a pleasure it is to return to SOAS today. For those of you that I am yet to meet, I was working here at SOAS, as Alicia said, from 2007 until 2023. And I'm thrilled to return today to introduce my colleague and precious friend, Professor Awino Okech, to you all. I'm going to reflect on two acts that I have been privileged to undertake here at SOAS, the University of London. And for those of you in the SOAS community that are here in the audience, you'll know that many wonderful, inspiring, challenging, and life-changing things happen at this university. But I'm just going to tell you about two. The first was in 2016. At the time, I was the chair of the wonderful intellectual hub that is the SOAS Centre for Gender Studies, a space where we built community, resilience, intellectual excellence, and plural feminist and queer possibilities. In April 2016, we were recruiting for a new lecturer in gender studies. And as you can imagine, the field was fairly illustrious. But one candidate, well, their presentation of their research to colleagues and students was simply another level. And I probably should add, I've been on quite a few recruitment panels over the years, and that presentation still stands out amongst them all. It was bold, deeply integrating analytical excellence with a commitment to activism, feminist practice, and both a forward and backward-looking reach, in the sense of honouring those who had written, thought and transformed feminist thinking before, while recognising and cultivating a space for those who were to follow. Of course, that presentation was my first opportunity to meet and listen to Awino, and yet it was simply a sign of all that was to follow. And I'm so very proud to have worked at a university and in a Centre for Gender Studies that saw and celebrated and appointed that brilliant African feminist scholar. It's not only one of the proudest things that I have been involved in, but it's also one of the smartest things this university has done. Let's fast forward to today. The SOAS Centre for Gender Studies is now complemented and enhanced by the groundbreaking, world-leading thought space that is the Feminist Centre for Racial Justice. With that candidate that we appointed in April 2016 at the helm as founding director, as designer of the centre and its mandate, and as thought leader. If you are unaware of the work that the Feminist Centre for Racial Justice does, then you might start with its podcast, Runway to Feminist Justice, which epitomises the centre's ethos, honouring feminist trailblazers while making space for new feminist voices. While you're looking over the centre's work and achievements, notice the Movement Builders School, a space for engaging new and diverse voice in knowledge generation. Or perhaps pay attention to the Feminist Centre for Racial Justice funding opportunities for PhD students, for activists in residence, and the deep commitment to collaborative working opportunities. The centre epitomises the brilliance and intellectual rigour, the deep feminist care and global excellence that I was very fortunate to witness in that presentation in April 2016. Since that time, I've watched Dr. Okech's recognition as a key African feminist scholar whose scholarship across feminist, queer, and African methodologies, conflict and security studies, racial justice, protest and resistance, Black internationalism, is nothing short of world-changing. The centre, which is designed via a non-hierarchical, radically inclusive and dynamic leadership model, goes to the heart of Dr. Okech's intellectual contribution and is a lesson for us all in how an institutional space need not be constrained by the many forces that challenge our commitment to linking our scholarship with our practice. The second incredible, inspiring opportunity I've had here at SOAS that I want to speak to you about is this evening. It is thus one that you now all have the privilege to share, the welcoming to the stage and the opportunity to introduce to you all African feminist scholar and thought leader, Professor Awino Okech.
Well, Gina, thank you very much for that generous introduction. Let me begin by recognizing the invisible labor that makes these celebrations possible. My deepest appreciation goes to the events, IT, and catering teams. We all know that personal and professional journeys are shaped by collaborators, seen and unseen, champions known and unknown, professional friendships that are strengthened, and chosen family that sustain us with radical transparency and love when life becomes complex. So it is to the acknowledgement of my fellow travelers that I turn. Let me begin by appreciating my friends who have traveled from outside and within the UK for being here. I'm grateful for your professional and personal friendship, as well as the flexibility of your bank accounts. I hope that when the time comes, as Kenyans say, I will revenge appropriately. I want to acknowledge the teaching and research opportunities provided at the African Gender Institute at the University of Cape Town during my postgraduate studies, and the adjunct faculty position at the African Leadership Center at King's College London much later. Both allowed me to test ideas and build muscle in teaching and research that laid the foundation for the work I developed at SOAS. Finally, I want to thank my nuclear family for enabling me to graduate debt-free and for critical support over the years. I want to recognize two of my sisters who are here today, who have taken time off work and traveled from the US and Switzerland to be here. A special mention to the first Professor Okech in the family who inspired my academic journey. I cannot begin this inaugural lecture without paying homage to an important person in my life who is not here today. My late mother, Dolphin Achieng Asin Okech. My mother belonged to a generation of African educators in Kenya who in the late 70s and early 80s were part of the Africanization of leadership across formerly white-only schools. In her case, she became the first African and woman in that role in the school she went on to lead successfully for over a decade. I am who I am today, including my decision to study gender studies and pursue the work that I do because of my mother and her work. I wanted to become a teacher because of how fondly her students spoke about her, despite being no-nonsense. My colleagues and students will understand that my no-nonsense approach is in the DNA. It is by observing her leadership that I learned how to respond to the structural inequalities that women and girls face in our societies. Mama, this lecture is dedicated to you. In the time I have left, I will offer a snapshot of my intellectual journey by mapping the socioeconomic and political contexts that influenced and shaped my work. You will note that this is as much about how geographies and events become critical to my intellectual inquiry, the role of methodology, and communities of practice. You will also observe that two questions have remained constant in my intellectual inquiry. First, how do those relegated to the periphery of society at the intersection of gender, race, and class transform power and recenter equitable outcomes for all as part of post-flag independence nation-state building projects? Second, how do we center feminist imaginaries as the site for transformational nation and state-making projects? Today, I present to you the evolution of my understanding of these questions and my modest contribution through research, policy engagement, and conscientizing work. I was invited to study at the University of Nairobi, the only university north of the Limpopo River and south of the Sahara Desert, where I completed a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in political science. This was at the height of the Bretton Woods Institution's structural adjustment programs. Historian Paul Zeleza, in tracing the evolution of universities in Africa, examines the decimation of public universities during the SARS period due to donor conditionalities that included the requirement to divest from higher education, thus leading to a rise in the privatization and marketization of higher education, and in its wake, dwindling education offers in public universities. The period 1998 to 2002, when I was at the University of Nairobi, coincided with the consolidation of Kenya's second wave democracy movement. In 1991, Section 2A of the Constitution was repealed, thereby reintroducing multipartism. NGOs grew as the vehicles for delivering public goods, and the 20-plus year rule of Daniel Arap Moi was slowly being chipped away. Additionally, the specter of politically ignited conflicts became a feature of how Kenyans were scared into the perception that a multi-party environment would be a source of division rather than one that created space for more generative political futures. It is worth noting that during this period, academics and politically active students were disappeared, detained without trial, tortured, and some forced into exile because the university was a site that led conversations on the National Pact and produced consequential political actors. It was during my time at the University of Nairobi that I joined a group of young Kenyans who were organizing under the banner Amani People's Theatre. Amani means peace in Kiswahili. APT was interested in the role of liberatory methodologies as developed by Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and Augusto Boal, Theatre of the Oppressed, to work with displaced communities in the broad area known as the Rift Valley, a historical epicenter of violence and the breadbasket of the country. Our objective was to examine the causes of conflict, community repair, and conflict relapse. In a country whose politics is often reductively read as being ethnic in character, it is critical to note that those we worked with never spoke about how much they hated Y community. It was their material realities, emerging as contestations around the proverbial national cake, that served as the bedrock for the politicization of ethnicity and subsequently the ethnicization of politics. We can draw parallels to rhetoric that underpins Make America Great Again, Brexit, and various fascist movements re-emerging across the UK and Europe. It is during this period that my foundational interest in conflict and peace studies is cultivated, and the role of gender in redrawing national boundaries. In addition, the notion of communities rather than elites as being central to defining what positive and sustainable peace is, and the role of interdisciplinary methodologies as useful to making sense of complex and often traumatic histories become critical. Freirean and Boalian ideas of conscientization and building a constituency of change from the ground up has become a central tenet for how I see the world. Johan Galtung's positive peace informed my praxis. Galtung defines the goal of peacehood as lying in identifying and addressing the structural factors in the conflict situation. This period of deep praxis work invested in historicizing ethno-nationalist politics and the socio-economic questions that heightened vulnerabilities exploited by the political elite. Three questions that we grappled with. How do we reconcile land as a means of production alongside its ancestral importance? The land question is not only about who controls the means of production, but also its role as a site of homemaking. Second, how do we understand reproduction as a technology of violence? Every conflict produces national discourses about women as producers, healers, and guardians of the nation based on their reproductive capacities. All these discourses rely on various levels of surveillance and control of women's bodies. And finally, what forms of political organization and social contracts are central to redressing structural inequalities? When I moved to the University of Cape Town's African Gender Institute to pursue my postgraduate degrees, master's and later PhD, I took this foundational interest in conflict and participatory methods to a context that was still convulsing under the weight of its apartheid history, which was also felt in the bubbling disaffection towards Africans and their place in the new South Africa. I was awarded the Steve Biko Fellowship in 2006 to pursue my PhD. It was in the name of Steve Biko that the first truly Pan-African approach to resourcing the next generation of African scholars would emerge at UCT. It was at the AGI where three things happened that were critical to my intellectual mission. First, I encountered leading African feminist intellectuals and practitioners, not only through their writing in the form of assigned material, but through their presence. The task of building thriving and generative intellectual communities was something I observed in real time at the AGI, where the seamless dance between the academy, activists, and policymakers was not seen as innovation. It simply was. Because as feminists, we know our work makes no sense if it is not rooted in the worlds we occupy. Second was the deliberate intellectual decision by our lecturers to pay attention to context. We were in Africa, and knowledge generated within it was key to making sense of our lived realities before the globe ran interference. I encountered Fatou Sow, Zenta Dese, Pat McFadden, Georgie Sikata, Manya Labsberg, Tandika Mkandawire, Kopano Ratele, and many others, before I encountered Judith Butler and Audre Lorde. It matters that these were my first feminist intellectual forebearers. Long before decolonizing our reading list became all the rage, it was in action at the AGI. Third, the AGI, like other gender studies centers globally, were in a constant battle to survive because of the tactical under-resourcing and perennial threats of closure. We know today that these are efforts to discipline radical feminist work back into the logics of the market that are often evacuated of any structural interrogation. Understanding this very early on was critical to institutional building and strengthening work that I have taken on later in life. It is always a political project to keep feminist work alive, whether academic or not. Part of the scholarship that emerged during this period was invested in the dance between theory, methods, and change, centering African feminist thinkers around gender, nation, and state-making. My PhD lives in a book, Widow Inheritance and Contested Citizenship in Kenya, in which I think through the meaning of a cultural practice as a vehicle for nation and state building. My research shifted focus from mainstream approaches to analyzing widow inheritance as a women's rights abuse, to examining cultural practices as a framework through which nations organize material claims to the state and the role of women's bodies as vectors for managing those contested claims. Other aspects of my work during this period flow from participatory theater and theater making as methodologies to think through gender, citizenship, belonging, and placemaking in South Africa 10 years after the historic 1994 elections. Two of the publications you see on the screen explore questions of gender, xenophobia, and placemaking in Cape Town. My gratitude to the Mother Tongue Project for providing a container for this work in Cape Town. Whilst pursuing my PhD at UCT, I took a short detour to manage a Pan-African program on gender and conflict with a leading international development organization, Accord International. At Accord International, I was involved in transnational work with colleagues who were grappling with some of Africa's most deadly conflicts and its aftermaths: a post-genocide Rwanda, the intractable conflict in the DRC, and the conflict in the greater north of Uganda. I was privileged to travel across these countries and work with colleagues to design advocacy agendas at a continental level. This period was also an important reminder about what I saw as my contribution to society. Consequently, it will come as no surprise that upon completing my PhD, I did not pursue an academic job. Instead, I focused on finding communities where I could support shaping some practical interventions on urgent political questions on the continent. This period was animated by questions around asymmetrical conflict, discourses on war and terror, and its material implications for security. Between 2013 to 2016, two collaborations are worth foregrounding for their contribution to these questions. Between 2014 and 2015, I served as a co-principal investigator on a year-long multi-country study on the costs and consequences of conflict in the Sahel, commissioned by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, with Professor Oloni Shakin serving as the principal investigator. I led the work in Burkina Faso and Niger. This work was animated to a great degree by the disintegration of the Libyan state post-Gaddafi's death and its implication for the Sahel, which is a historically borderless territory in which communities across the now boundaried nations such as Libya, Sudan, Niger, Mali, and Nigeria freely moved and traded. However, this so-called ungoverned space, we know it is governed in other ways, also provided ground for the emergence of groups waging asymmetrical warfare through a range of organizations such as Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, with varying ideological and political interests. All of this was compounded by significant Western military presence and so-called development investments across the G5 Sahel states. That's Burkina Faso, Chad, Mauritania, Niger, and Mali. The implications of the complexities of insecurity, governance, and underdevelopment are being witnessed today in the new military leadership formations in the region. A second collaboration in 2014 at the invitation of Professor Ebo Hachful at the African Security Sector Network, who is also known for his magnum opus with Abdoulaye Batili, the military and militarism in Africa, was leading support to the African Union in developing its gender and security sector reform policy framework. Now, I know there are debates about the utility of the industry that surrounds SSR, what interests it does and does not serve. However, in many African contexts, it is through the SSR framework that reforms around greater oversight over defense expenditure, the role of parliamentary oversight committees, redefining the role of the police away from colonial home guards, and investment in dealing with gender-based crimes has flourished. I worked with Professor Cheryl Hendricks and Ekoma Alaga, where we laid emphasis that the fact was not about integration and inclusion of women, but altering our understanding of the function of security institutions and what security looks like when we take gender seriously. Our security metrics have a lot to do with our daily realities and experiences. Now, we know that across the African continent, contemporary approaches to dealing with asymmetrical conflict and defining national security objectives is influenced by the legacies and continuities of the 9/11 Twin Tower attack in the US. The American Patriot Act of 2001, which was the American policy response after the 9/11 attack, has been copy-pasted across various jurisdictions with deleterious effects, including sanctioning arrest, detention, extrajudicial killings, and even disappearance of so-called suspects, all ostensibly to secure people. We know that this idea of safety often occurs by criminalizing communities through overt and covert ways, such as economic deprivation, surveillance, over-policing, which only lead to communities that are resentful of the state due to their peripheral status. We also know that terror has become an easy lexicon used by the political elite to discipline anyone articulating dissent against a sitting regime. I recall traveling to Bujumbura, Burundi on an assignment in 2015 after the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi. I arrived to heightened security at the airport. When I asked my host what was going on, she said, suspected Al-Shabaab terrorists were captured over the weekend. There was no evidence at the time to suggest that Al-Shabaab had spread its tentacles to landlocked Burundi. On further inquiry, I learned that the sitting regime needed to manage its political opposition, and the language of terrorism became useful in that exercise. My subsequent work on women associated with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, facilitated by the ALC and their local partner NIM Foundation, and the impact of the Westgate terror attack in Nairobi on Somali masculinities reflects on the gendered structures of peace in the face of asymmetrical conflict. I will now turn to the work that has animated my research and public-facing work in the last 5 years and its importance in this historical moment. But let me begin with a vignette. In April 2012, I attended a high-level meeting convened by the African Union in Tunis to reflect on the wave of popular uprisings that swept through Egypt and Tunisia. During the meeting, an African diplomat questioned whether this protest could be understood within the AU's unconstitutional change of government framework. The UCG framework is anchored in the 1997 Lome Declaration, which codifies constitutional means of changing governments as free and fair elections. Military coup d'etats, interventions by mercenaries and armed dissident groups, and the refusal of an incumbent to relinquish power after the winning party wins a free and fair election are therefore not constitutional means. There was a robust debate in the meeting on what it meant to consider citizens who rise against a government they put in power through the vote as unconstitutional. Where does constitutionality lie if not in the hands of the populace who cede certain rights to leaders through negotiated processes such as elections? Where do citizens turn when electoral processes are compromised or when results are cooked in a computer? Across Africa, the number of protests rose from 2,250 in 2011 to 10,605 in 2020, which was at its peak. These protests are catalyzed by a range of issues, but at their base are governance deficits manifest in the manipulation of elections through power-sharing agreements, corruption, and service delivery questions. My work in this period has intervened in these debates through 3 questions. What do feminist theories and movements show, not tell us, show about building transformative change? How do we prepare for just and equitable power to curtail the inevitable usurpation of people's power, as was seen in Egypt, Tunisia, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and Zimbabwe, to name a few? How do we ideologically and intellectually prepare the next generation of feminist intellectuals and activists? These questions have been explored in a few publications, but 3 are foregrounded here. an edited book on gender protest and political change, and 2 journal articles. The Feminist Movement Building Schools and the PhD fellowships at the Feminist Center for Racial Justice are a direct intervention on question 3. How change happens, what will sustain transformative and just societies, remains a pressing and urgent question today. We are witnessing moral panics animated through debates on gender and sexuality to redraw the boundaries of who belongs and who can lay claims to the nation state. Ethno-nationalism is being reified, and there is a heightened surveillance on women's reproductive capacities and freedoms as part of affirming racially and ethnically pure nations. There is a direct attack on critical knowledge production and research and the institutions that deliver it. So, what do we do? Let me invoke a global trailblazer, the late Professor Wangari Maathai. Now, if there are people who do not know who she is, Wangari Maathai was a woman of many fasts, including being the first African woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. One of my favorite quotes from Wangari states as follows: "It is the little things citizens do. That's what will make the difference. My little thing is planting trees." So what are my little things? I retain a commitment to strengthening African feminist epistemic communities through transnational and multidisciplinary collaborations beyond the academy, because it is this cross-sector work that, in my view, offers a critical antidote at this moment. I continue to invest in partnerships with continental research centers such as CODESRIA and academic centers on the continent, as is evident in the Feminist Center for Racial Justice's partnership with the Women and Gender Studies Center at Makerere University. As a teacher, I am keen for SOAS students to have access to knowledge from leading African feminist practitioners. In the past, this was made possible by my sponsorship of the late Eva Joyce Wynne and Kare Murungi as professors of practice. Today, that work continues through archival and memory investments in the Runway to Feminist Justice podcast. Finally, I have clarity that my next phase is about returning home through research and knowledge in service of movement building. Friends, colleagues, and fellow travelers, as I conclude, let me leave you with 3 invitations. When I came to the UK in 2016, there were 24 Black women professors. 9 years later, that number has inched to slightly over 80, and at least 5 of them are here today. Professor Ikpe, Sikata, Oloni Shakin, Hastrap, Gwantai, and perhaps 1 or 2 of my other SOAS colleagues may be in the audience. The Black professoriate in the UK is slightly under 1%, with the Higher Education Statistics Agency putting the number at 250 in January 2025, out of a total of 25,670 professors. When I took on a senior leadership role as the Associate Director Equity here at SOAS 3 years ago, there were only 11 Black academics on permanent contracts. 5 of those were professors across 2 departments, 3 in the School of Law and 2 in the School of Finance and Management. This was in a staff body of slightly under 520 academic staff. That number has increased to 24 in a staff body of about 650 academics. I invite you to sit with those numbers. There are enough studies that explain why the outcomes for Black academics generally and women specifically remain as they are in the UK higher education sector. I will not rehearse this literature. However, there is a wonderful fact. The power is in your hands. Staff who oversee hiring and shape the demographic profile of your departments. So to you, I leave this question. Who is in your community? What is the work you are doing to address these racialized disparities in a world that is regressing on questions of race and gender? 2, we are living in a moment where there is a concerted attack on civil liberties against everyone, from movements, private philanthropy to academics. Yet, what is narrowly defined as the catalyst for change movements often leaves out research centers and universities as critical nodes. Yet, it is to universities that authoritarians target first. We must be front and center in translating the solutions to the world's challenges. As the late Guinea-Bissau anti-colonial organizer and intellectual Amilcar Cabral said, nobody has yet made a successful revolution without a revolutionary theory. What are we resourcing in this moment? Finally, in October 2016, as I settled into my lectureship at SOAS, my academic senior, Professor Oloni Shakin, asked me, "Now that you have this job, what's your plan?" I thought to myself, I'm still adjusting to what feels like a very bad decision to uproot my life in Nairobi and move into these cupboards you call flats in London. Give me a break. Yet, I have returned to that simple question repeatedly for professional and personal clarity at difficult moments. I pass the gift of that question to early career academics in the room and reframe it. What is your purpose? That purpose must be intentional and not accidental to your academic mission. The academy can either be about how your academic peers praise your articles, the awards you acquire, or being called a rising star. Don't get me wrong, all of that is very important. But it can also be about how your academic work makes meaning in the world beyond this ivory tower. What is your purpose? Who are you writing for? And do your people know you? Asanteni sana. Thank you.